I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply turned around, walked back through those glass doors, and sat in my truck for a long time without starting the engine. That was the day my son had security remove me from the lobby of the building I had helped him lease. I'm 63 years old. I've been through things that would have broken most men: a factory layoff at 41, a divorce that gutted me financially at 44, 3 years of rebuilding from scratch, with nothing but a contractor's license and a willingness to work until my hands bled. By the time I was 50, I had built something real, not flashy, not the kind of wealth that announces itself at dinner parties, but solid, the kind that stays. My name is Robert Callahan. Most people who know me call me Bob. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that takes 10 minutes to kick in. I shop at the same grocery store I've shopped at for 20 years. I wear the same brand of boots I wore when I was laying tile in other people's bathrooms. None of that has changed, even though a lot of other things have. My son Marcus is 34. He has his mother's eyes and her talent for making everything look effortless. He grew up watching me work, and somewhere along the way, he decided that the work itself was the embarrassing part, not the struggle, but the calluses, the dirty truck. The fact that I would show up to his college graduation in a flannel shirt because I hadn't thought to buy a new one. He was always a little ashamed of me. I told myself it was just youth. I told myself he'd grow out of it. I was wrong about that. 7 years ago, Marcus came to me with an idea. He wanted to build a software platform that helped small contractors, people like the ones I used to work alongside, manage their bids, track their materials, invoice their clients. He had the concept, the drive, and a laptop. What he didn't have was office space, startup capital, or a single business connection in the real world. I gave him all three. I let him use the top floor of one of my commercial properties on the north side, rent-free, for the first 2 years. I introduced him to 3 of the most reliable attorneys and accountants I knew. I wired him the first $100,000 without asking for a single piece of collateral, because he was my son, and I believed in what he was trying to build. There was one thing I asked for in return. One thing. I told him I wanted to be a silent partner, not involved in the day-to-day, not attending meetings or giving opinions on product decisions. Just a name on a piece of paper, a small stake in what we were building together. I told him that someday, if the company ever became something big, I wanted to be able to say I was part of it. Not for the money. I had enough money. I wanted to be part of his story. Marcus agreed. We had it drawn up properly by Frank Whitmore, an attorney I'd worked with for 15 years. 23% equity, silent partnership, no board seat, no voting rights. Clean and simple. Marcus signed it. I signed it. Frank filed it. And then I stepped back completely and let my son run his company. For 5 years, I watched from a distance. I didn't interfere. I didn't give unsolicited advice. When he called me, I listened. When he didn't call, I didn't push. I paid attention to what he was building, not because I was watching my investment, but because I was proud of him. The platform grew. They hired 40 people. They had clients in 31 states. And then Derek Sloan walked into the picture. Derek was a venture capitalist from San Francisco. Mid-40s, polished. The kind of man who wears a blazer over a t-shirt and calls it a brand. He came in through a mutual connection in Marcus's network, expressed interest in the company, and within 6 months had positioned himself as more than just a potential investor. He was at every team dinner. He was CC'd on emails I was never supposed to see. He started talking to Marcus about what it would mean to professionalize the business before a major acquisition. I heard about this in pieces. Marcus mentioned Derek casually at first, the way you mention someone you're trying to impress. Then he started quoting him. Then he started dressing like him. I didn't say anything for a while, but I watched. The first real warning sign came at Thanksgiving. Marcus and his wife Vanessa hosted that year, first time they'd offered, and I was glad for it. I drove up to their house in Evanston, brought 2 bottles of good wine I'd been saving, and knocked on the door. Vanessa let me in with that tight smile she'd been wearing around me for the past year. There were other guests, people from Marcus's professional circle, men in expensive casual clothes, women who asked me what I did and then seemed to lose interest the moment I answered. At some point during dinner, someone brought up the company's growth. Marcus started talking about the upcoming acquisition. A technology firm out of Boston had made a formal offer, $40 million. The table was impressed. I was happy for him. Then Derek, who was apparently also at Thanksgiving dinner, leaned over to Marcus and said something I wasn't supposed to hear. I'm hard of hearing in my left ear from years near power tools, but my right ear is sharp as ever. He said, "You'll need to get your house in order before the paperwork moves forward. Investors don't like complications." Marcus glanced at me quickly, just a glance. Then he looked away. I knew what that meant. I'd known for a while, if I was honest with myself. But knowing something and being ready to accept it are two different things. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Marcus called me. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I said of course. We sat in a diner near my office, and he ordered black coffee and wouldn't look at me directly for the first 5 minutes. I waited. I've never been a man who fills silence with noise. Finally, he said, "Dad, the acquisition is moving fast. The deal's going to close in about 6 weeks. The team at the acquiring firm has been doing due diligence, and they flagged your partnership stake." I told him I imagined they would. He said, "Derek thinks, and honestly, I agree that it would look cleaner if you weren't part of the deal. If your stake wasn't part of the cap table, going into the close." I asked him what he was proposing. He pulled out a folder. There was a document inside a buyout offer. He slid it across the table without making eye contact. I looked at the number. It was insultingly low. Not even close to what 23% of a $40 million acquisition would represent. It was the kind of number you offer someone when you're hoping they don't know what they're owed. I asked him if he'd read what he was asking me to sign. He said Derek's legal team had put it together. I asked him if Frank had looked at it. He said he hadn't wanted to involve Frank. I put the folder back on the table. I told Marcus that I wasn't going to sign anything that night, that I needed time to review it carefully, and that we should talk again before the close date. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands flat on the table. I did not let him see what was moving through me. He seemed relieved that I hadn't caused a scene. He said that was totally reasonable, completely fair, and that he appreciated my understanding. He paid for the coffee. We hugged in the parking lot in that stiff way we'd been hugging for a few years. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I wasn't angry about the money. I want to be clear about that. I have enough. I have always had enough, and what I built was never about accumulating more. What made me go quiet that night, what made me sit at that kitchen table until almost 2 a.m. was something else entirely. It was the folder, the way he slid it across to me without looking me in the eye, the way Derek's name came up before Frank's, the way my son, in that diner, was not talking to me like a father. He was talking to me like a problem he needed to manage before a deadline. I called Frank the next morning. I told him everything. Frank is a good man, careful, methodical, the kind of attorney who reads every line twice and never makes promises he can't keep. He pulled the original partnership documents and reviewed the buyout offer Marcus had handed me. When he called me back that afternoon, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. He said, "Bob, that offer is about 11% of what you're legally owed." I said I figured something like that. He said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. I told him to hold on to everything, to keep his calendar clear for the next month, and to wait for my call. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone, was that I had already decided I wasn't going to sign anything. Not that offer. Not any revised version of it. I was going to wait and see what my son did next. I was going to give him the chance to come back to me and do the right thing on his own. Some part of me, the part that had driven him to baseball practice and helped him with his college application essays, and stood in the hospital at 3 a.m. when he was 7 years old and running a fever of 104, that part still believed he might. The weeks passed. Marcus did not call. Vanessa sent a group text about Christmas plans that felt designed to establish normalcy. Derek apparently flew in from San Francisco and took Marcus's whole team to a dinner at a restaurant that didn't have prices on the menu. 5 days before the scheduled closing, I received a text from Marcus. Not a call, a text. Dad, the deal closes Friday at 10 a.m. downtown. Derek and the legal team thought it would be best if you weren't there. It's a professional environment, and I need everyone focused. I'll call you this weekend, and we can figure out next steps. Thanks for understanding. I read it twice. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. I looked out the window at the backyard where I'd built a deck the summer Marcus turned 12, where we'd spent a whole weekend measuring and cutting and hammering together, where he'd been so proud of himself when it was done that he'd made me take a photograph of him standing on the finished boards with his arms spread wide. I thought about that photograph for a long time. Then I called Frank. I told him the closing was Friday. I told him what the text said. I told him to be at the title company's office on Michigan Avenue at 9:30 in the morning, to bring every document he had, and to say nothing to anyone until I arrived. Frank asked me what I was planning. I told him I was going to let Marcus close his deal. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Chicago morning that doesn't apologize for itself. I put on a good coat, not a new one, but a clean one, a charcoal wool overcoat I'd owned for 15 years that had held its shape. I drove downtown. I found parking 2 blocks from the building where the closing was being held, the same building where I had co-signed the original office lease 7 years ago, the building my son had eventually outgrown and upgraded from, the address that used to be in my contacts under Marcus, work. I walked into the lobby and gave my name to the security desk. The young man behind the desk typed something, paused, and then looked up at me with the particular expression of someone who has been trained to deliver bad news politely. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the approved guest list for the Callahan software closing." I told him I was Robert Callahan. I told him I was the company's founding partner. He typed again. He picked up a phone and spoke quietly to someone. He put it down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan. I've been instructed that you don't have clearance for this floor today." I stood there for a moment. I looked at the elevator bank. I looked at the young man who was genuinely apologetic in the way that people are when they're following orders they didn't write. I looked at the revolving doors behind me. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to speak to someone. I said, "Thank you." And I meant it not sarcastically, just as a reflex, the way men of a certain era were raised to be civil to people doing their jobs. And I walked back out through those glass doors and sat in my truck. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes. The heat clicked on eventually. I watched people in good coats walk past on the sidewalk, all of them somewhere important, all of them moving at the pace of people who believe the day belongs to them. Then I called Frank. I asked him if he was in position. He said he was. I told him it was time. Here is what my son did not know. Here is what Derek Sloan, with all his San Francisco polish and his legal team and his dinner reservations, had apparently failed to discover in his due diligence. The original partnership agreement I had signed with Marcus 7 years ago contained a clause inserted at my request, reviewed by Frank, signed by Marcus without objection at the time, that required my written consent for any equity transfer, acquisition, or change of control event involving the company. Not a buyout of my stake, not a renegotiation. My actual written, notarized consent. It wasn't a majority consent clause. It wasn't a board vote. It was my signature, specifically, on a consent to transfer form before any acquisition could legally close. No form had been sent to me. No request for consent had been made through proper legal channels. Marcus had handed me an informal buyout offer in a diner, and then, when I neither signed it nor rejected it formally, had apparently assumed my silence meant compliance. It did not mean compliance. At 9:47 that morning, Frank walked into the closing room on the 14th floor and introduced himself to the room. He placed a certified letter on the table in front of the acquiring firm's lead counsel. He explained, quietly and without drama, that the proposed acquisition could not legally proceed without the written consent of Robert Callahan, founding silent partner who had not provided that consent and was not presently inclined to do so. Frank told me later that the room went very still. He said the acquiring firm's attorney asked to see the original partnership documents. Frank had brought copies. The attorney read the relevant clause. He read it again. Then he set it down and looked at Marcus. And the look on Marcus's face, Frank said, was the look of a man who has just understood that the floor is not where he thought it was. The closing was suspended. I was already on the highway heading home when Frank called to tell me. I listened to him describe what had happened. I thanked him. I asked him to send a formal letter to Marcus's attorney, indicating that I was open to discussing a resolution, but that any future communication would need to go through proper legal channels and include fair market valuation of my stake. Then I drove home and made a pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what it means to love someone who has stopped being able to see you clearly. Marcus called that afternoon. I let it ring. He called twice more, and then he texted, "Dad, I don't understand what happened. We need to talk." I waited 24 hours before I responded. Not out of spite. I needed to be calm. I needed to be the version of myself that doesn't say things he regrets. When I called him back, I let him speak first. He started explaining, Derek had said, the legal team had assumed there must have been a miscommunication. The clause was probably just a formality, and I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Marcus, I'm not angry." He said, "Dad," I said, "let me finish." I told him that I had been watching him for the past year become someone I didn't recognize. I told him that I had sat across from him in that diner and seen him slide a paper across the table like I was a vendor he was trying to settle with, not his father. I told him that I had received a text, not a call. A text telling me I wasn't welcome at a closing for a company I had helped create. I told him that none of that was Derek's fault. I told him that Derek didn't raise him. I did. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Marcus said, "I know." His voice was different. The polish was gone. He sounded like the kid who used to call me from college when things went wrong, not performing anything, just talking. I told him the deal wasn't dead. I told him I had no interest in blowing up what he'd spent 7 years building. I told him I would sign the consent. I would accept a fair buyout, not Derek's number, but a real one, calculated properly. And I would sign it gladly, because I never wanted his money. I wanted something else. He asked me what. I told him I wanted him to sit across from me, in person, without Derek in the room, and explain to me when I became someone to be managed, rather than someone to be loved. I told him I wanted him to think about what kind of man he was becoming, and whether that man was someone he'd actually be happy being in 20 years. I told him that if he could do that, not fix everything, not make a grand gesture, just actually show up and have an honest conversation, then I would sign whatever needed to be signed and we could find a way forward. He said, "Okay, Dad." He said it quietly, not like a man agreeing to a business term, like a son. We met the following Tuesday at the same diner. Marcus came alone. He got there before me, which he almost never does. And when I walked in, he was already at the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, not on his phone, just sitting there. He looked tired. The kind of tired that isn't from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too long. I sat down. The waitress came. I ordered what I always order. We sat together for almost 2 hours. He talked. I talked. There were things said that had needed to be said for years, about his mother's departure and what it had done to both of us, about the years when I was working so hard I was physically present, but essentially elsewhere. About the way ambition can start as a virtue and slowly, quietly become a substitute for everything it was supposed to fund. He told me that Derek had convinced him that having a non-professional founding partner on the cap table would signal immaturity to the acquiring firm. That having a father who drove an old truck and didn't know what due diligence data room meant would make Marcus look like an amateur. He said that he had agreed, and that he had felt ashamed of agreeing even as he was doing it. He said, "I know what you did for me, Dad. I've always known. I let someone convince me that acknowledging it would make me look weak. I looked at my son for a long time, this boy I had driven to school and coached in Little League, and sat up with through fevers and failures and every ordinary heartbreak of growing up. This man who had built something real, something that 40 people depended on, something that started in an office I gave him in a building I owned. I said, weakness would have been letting me find out from a lawyer. You came to this table. That counts." He looked like he might cry, and then he didn't, because he's my son, and we don't, as a rule. Instead, he nodded once and looked at the window, and then back at me. 3 days later, Frank sent the consent to transfer paperwork. I signed it. The fair market valuation came in at just under $9 million for my 23% stake. I signed that too. The acquisition closed on a Thursday morning in February. I was not in the room because I had never needed to be in the room. That was never what I wanted. Marcus called me that evening from what sounded like a restaurant full of people celebrating. He excused himself and stepped outside and called me from the sidewalk. He said, "It closed, Dad." I told him I was glad. He said, "I want you to know that I told the team today at dinner, in front of everyone, about the original deal, about the office space, about the first 100,000, about all of it." He paused. "I told them you were the reason any of this was possible." I didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "Derek wasn't there." I asked him how that had come about. He said quietly, "I ended the advisory relationship. Last week, I sat with that for a moment. I told him that what he built was his, that I had only ever been a small part of the foundation, that the 40 floors above that foundation were entirely his work, and he should never let anyone take that from him, including me." He laughed a little, the laugh I remembered from when he was younger, and something genuinely surprised him. Then he said, "Dad, I want to come see you this weekend. Just to come over, if that's okay." I told him the door was always open. I told him the deck was still standing, if he wanted to sit outside. He said he'd bring coffee. That Saturday, Marcus showed up at 9 in the morning with 2 cups from the coffee shop down the street from his house, the expensive kind, which I never buy for myself, and which tasted exactly the same as the kind I make at home, though I didn't say that. We sat on the deck I had built the summer he was 12. It was cold but clear, the kind of winter day that reminds you that spring is coming eventually, even if it doesn't feel like it. We didn't talk about the deal. We didn't talk about Derek. We talked about his grandfather, my father, who I'd been thinking about lately, a man who worked in a steel mill for 30 years and never once complained about it, who believed that dignity was not something you performed for an audience, but something you carried quietly inside yourself and protected as carefully as anything you owned. Marcus had only known him for a few years before he died, but he remembered him. He said, "I think I understand him better now than I did when I was a kid." I told him that's usually how it works. We sat there for another hour, long enough for the coffee to go cold and for neither of us to care. Eventually, Marcus said he had to get back to Vanessa. He stood up, and for a moment he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was small and he'd done something wrong, and he knew it and I knew it and no one was pretending otherwise. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it." I stood up too. I am 63 years old and my knees take a moment in the cold, so there was nothing graceful about it. But I put my hand on his shoulder and I told him that we were going to be fine. Not that everything was fixed, not that the past year hadn't happened, but that we were going to be fine, which is a different thing, and which requires more of both of you than pretending. He nodded. He hugged me properly. Not the stiff parking lot version, but the real kind, the kind that admits something. Then he drove away, and I stood on the deck for a little while longer, looking at the yard, at the bare winter trees, at the particular stillness of a Saturday morning when there's nowhere to be. I've thought a lot in the years since about what it means to build something, not just a business or a deck or a career, but the slower, harder things: trust, character, the relationship between a father and a son that has to be rebuilt after it's been damaged. You can't do that work quickly, and you can't do it loudly. You have to show up, and then show up again, and then again after that, without a guarantee that it will be enough. I'm not a man who gives speeches. I'm not a man who knows how to make his life sound like a lesson. But if someone asked me, I would say this: the most powerful thing I did in that whole situation was not activating that consent clause, though I'm glad I had it. The most powerful thing I did was get up from that lobby chair, walk back out through those glass doors, and go home without breaking anything. Because I knew something that Derek Sloan did not know, and that Marcus, in that season, had forgotten. I knew that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had already built what I set out to build. The company was part of it, but only part. The rest of it was still standing. It was standing on a deck in the backyard. It was sitting across from me at a diner on a Tuesday afternoon. It was on the other end of a phone call from a restaurant sidewalk in February. Some things take a long time to be worth anything. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design. I still drive the same truck. I still shop at the same grocery store. My boots are the same brand, though I'm on a newer pair now. And on the first Saturday of most months, my son comes by with coffee, and we sit on the deck I built when he was 12, and we talk about the things that matter, not the deal, not the money, not Derek or the lawyers or any of it, but the things underneath all of that, which were always the point. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just waited for my son to find his way back. And he did.